So I just wanted to say that my role here is really to be very much a second fiddle to Jessica, who is both a scholar of the literature that she is talking about, but also the translator. So I wanted to open just very briefly to situate the novel in the way that I myself have come to kind of think about it and relate to it so far, and that is as an instructor, as a teacher, as a professor. So I've assigned the novel twice now to my students. First time just an excerpt of it before the whole book was published, and once this past quarter that just ended in my Jewish American literature class. And I realized that there is sort of a wonderful boomlet of translations happening from in many languages, I assume, but in the two languages in which I work and teach, Yiddish and Russian. So there's a number of really wonderful translation projects that are done by, a whole bunch of people, including people like Jessica, myself, and so many of our colleagues and friends, through the Yiddish Book Center's Translation Fellowship, for example, that has nurtured a number of projects, including this one, but also many others. That's on the Yiddish side of things. On the Russian side of things, I've been really helped by something called the Russian Library, which is a project that's published through Columbia University Press, which is in the process of releasing 100 new titles, newly translated from the Russian. And I find myself at the convergence of these, projects as a professor who teaches Russian literature, Russian Jewish experience, sometimes courses on Jewish literature in America, where novels like Miriam Karpilove's Diary of a Lonely Girl can significantly expand the notion of what the syllabus of Jewish American literature looks like. And it's kind of much kind of delayed to many of us who had wanted to teach these texts earlier, but had less access to them because they had not been translated. So the canon, right, if I were to use this word, or what we might teach, the syllabus, looks very different in a way that really kind of forces us to rethink what it is that we've been teaching by the addition of a novel, in this case, that really thinks deeply about what a position of a woman was in immigrant New York environment in the 19-teens. We know some of those stories from much celebrated male writers of the time, but not necessarily from women. So it's just incredibly helpful to rethink our syllabus this way. And I've similarly been helped by a number of Russian texts as well that are being translated. So I don't know all of the participants here, but I see that there's some names of colleagues in Russian and in Jewish studies, so it's kind of wonderful, and some others who I don't know, which is great. But as I was thinking about this, I was sort of thinking about the syllabi on the history of feminism in America that could benefit from a book like this that incorporates voices in other languages, not originally written in English, but in another language, on the courses that think about the movement of ideas between the United States and other countries, because as we'll talk about later, Karpilove is engaged in thinking with various radical thoughts that come from the old country, right, from the Russian Empire, and continue in America. In some ways about popular culture from the turn of the century to Sex and the City, that we think about a novel like this that engages with, for the lack of a better term, the dating scene of New York, in 19-teens in an extremely subversive way that is also very helpful to think about it. So I'm speaking for myself as a teacher, but also somebody who's now worked with students who read this novel, who find it incredibly fresh. It's 100 years old and discovered by Jessica for this translation project, but also just reads incredibly contemporary to so many of the students that I've taught because of its concerns that translate into the Me Too era, for example. but also into the era when we think about immigrants and the political affiliations and thoughts of immigrants in the United States. So I think that's maybe all I'll say by kind of how I just myself appreciate the existence of this text and its availability in the English translation that Jessica has now made possible, and the possibility that it can be included into these broader reading lists of different subjects that can help us really understand things much better and more nuance. So I think with this, maybe I'll just start, let's talk, Jessica. And I just wanted to ask you about maybe the origin story of this translation project.
Sure. Well, so you mentioned this idea of my having discovered this book, and I think the word discovered is it's a really interesting one in this context, because to a certain extent, for me, it felt like I had discovered something out of the blue. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to the project. But part of it was that it was there all along, and other people had found it previously, and so that the Yiddish Book Center had digitized it, which made it possible for me to find it. And some of the translation projects that you were talking about, I think really have enormously benefited from the digitization of Yiddish literature, which made it possible for, I was living in Kansas at the time and didn't have Yiddish literature close at hand, and yet I did because it was on the internet. And I'll also say that I think other people were reading this book before I started translating it. I know that Naomi Seidman mentions it in the introduction to a book that she wrote. Now I can't remember where I saw it. I know that Irina Klepvich mentioned to me that she had it on her bookshelf. And so it was sort of in existence, not just in the sense of it existed, but that it was in circulation to some degree before I found it. And yet, when I found it, I had so little understanding that something like this could exist or did exist in Yiddish literature. And I think that points to this sort of syllabus creation question that you have about what are we teaching students about what Yiddish literature was, and how could this, reshape the way we think about that. So the way I found the book was that I was writing a dissertation about interethnic romance in Jewish American fiction in Yiddish and English at Columbia University. And I needed a solid footnote about what free love was, because I had mentioned some various figures talking about free love. And the first thing that I did was I went to the Yiddish Book Center website and I searched in their database. This was before they had OCR for the entire collection, but you could search by the title names of books. And I searched for free love. And the first hit was Miriam Karpilove's book. And I had never heard of Miriam Karpilove, and I had no idea what this book was. And I started reading, and it was just the kind of thing that I had never read in Yiddish before. I'd never read, I feel that Miriam Karpilove has a sensibility, a sense of humor that's similar to mine. And I'd never read someone who sounded a little bit like me in Yiddish before. And so that was sort of a kind of like a personal revelation about what Yiddish could do. That was really exciting for me.
Footnote, but right, of course, what I meant by discovered, as in as a translator, right, you're helping those of us who are not necessarily have the proficiency with Yiddish, right, or the access to the sources that you did, to make it possible to read this book in turn. So that's sort of what a footnote. Footnotes are good. Maybe you could tell us who Karpilove was.
Sure. Well, I'm going to share a picture of her. This is one of the earliest pictures that I have of her. Actually, a descendant of one of her cousins shared this with me. He received it in the mail from her at some point. And so there she is in Coney Island, very shortly, I think, after she immigrated to the United States. So Miriam Karpilove was born in 1888, and she was born near Minsk in what is now Belarus. She was in the middle of one of the middle children in a family of 10 children. And she came to America in 1905. She came without her parents, but several of her brothers had immigrated along with her or came before her. And she settled in first in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is where she had several of her family members. Two of her brothers ran a locksmith shop there together. And then she made her way to New York City. She lived in Harlem and later in Seagate in Brooklyn. And she was part of a kind of bohemian world of Yiddish writers in New York City. And kind of from time to time, she would often go also to Connecticut. And she spent a short amount of time also in Palestine in the 1920s. Her first work appeared in print in 1906, so very shortly after she arrived in the United States, in a newspaper called Yiddish Fun, and she wrote in a number of sort of humor newspapers and wrote these very short stories and humorous tidbits. And then she continued her publishing career from the age of 18 until the mid 1940s. She was among the very few women who made their living as Yiddish writers. She supplemented her income working as a retoucher. She would hand color photographs, but most of her work was as a writer. She wrote hundreds of short stories, journalistic reportage, plays, and novels. And she was a very, very prolific, and also there's a sense that she had quite a stature. She was a known entity among Yiddish writers. And she wrote, Diary of a Lonely Girl is among one of her earlier books. She was, I think, particularly well known for her serial novels as well as her short stories. I'll share one more picture of her that's just to give a kind of different angle. This is also one of an earlier photograph that I have of her. This comes from the YIVO archive, and you see it's dated 1912. So this is shortly after she arrived in the United States. And you can see that she was first of all, she was very excited about being photographed. There are so many photographs of her because she worked in the photograph industry and because she was, I think, interested in her own image and in representing herself as quite rebellious, and also sort of, you can see this kind of like sexual provocativeness, I think, in this photograph as well. And you can see the kind of also, I don't know, just such an attitude. And you can see also her signature, the Miriam, she's got this kind of flourish in all of her writing. A lot of her personal letters have pictures of flowers in the corner as well. She was very interested in images and being ornate. Yeah, so that's a kind of a general overview. I can talk more about her career if it comes up, but just kind of a general sense of who she was.
Thank you. I love these photos. I think in the book, there's also one of her on the couch, kind of reclining on the couch. That was just such a fabulous photo. About this novel, it's a serialized work of fiction, I mean, brain tickles. I love the serialized literature and working with serialized literature, and every time I encounter novel that's serialized, I'd be reminded of the fact that so many works of fiction that we kind of know as a book between two covers once existed as a serialized text. Most famously maybe Charles Dickens, right, in the serialization of so many books that we know as novels in the London dailies and weeklies. To those of us who are fans of Russian literature, so much of the great novels of the 19th century were also serialized. Dostoevsky's novels, Tolstoy's novels, and sometimes it's really important it's hard to get ourselves back in the mind of the original readers, but sometimes it's really fascinating to think about how fiction was shaped through the process of serialization and the kind of time lag that there is between, the beginning process of a writer beginning to publish their work and maybe the end. Probably the most famous example to those of us who study Russian literature is Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, which, the serialization, it takes 4 years, and it begins long before Russia gets involved in a war with Turkey over the Balkans, and before Russia intervenes on behalf of Serbs. 3 years into serialization, and then, of course, Tolstoy sends Vronsky, Anna Karenina's beau, into combat, I think in part 7, if I can't remember which part it is, but it's in a later, much later installment, something that he couldn't have possibly conceptualized when he started the novel. So I'm really curious about what Karpilove's readers were reading when they were also reading installments of this work in the Yiddish newspapers.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to put up an image of the serialization just so you can kind of picture what it maybe looks like inside the newspaper. So you can kind of see this is what it looks like in print, and of course it's surrounded by other articles and other pieces as well. So this was printed during World War I, and there's a lot of news of the war that's happening as well. And the subtitle for the book, when it came out in book form afterward, and this is the print book, the subtitle is a battle against free love, and I think that word Kampf gegen freie Liebe is very intentional because it's in the context of so many other battles that are ongoing. And so there's a kind of, and there's a repeated use of war metaphor in the battle of the sexes that happens. So that's one aspect. Another thing is the conversations that are going on in the newspaper about birth control and about free love that she's participating in, and we can see the kind of there's a couple of moments where she makes specific reference to, oh well, I read in the newspaper the other day these new tenement laws, and how will that impact this particular character? And also there's a moment when the characters go and see a popular film that also received some attention within the body of the newspaper itself, and so there's some referentiality in the way that you're talking about Vronsky. But I think also I think that the diary itself lends itself to this serialization, that the two kind of go hand in hand, that there's this kind of immediacy of this is the thing that happened to me today, just like this is what's happening in the newspaper today. And then and that is a standalone thing. But if you understand the context from previous installments, then that will help shape how you understand what's going on in that particular installment. And so, yeah, and there's a kind of immediate present tense sensibility of the diary that goes hand in hand with this kind of the serialization.
So I would love to dig into some of the things that you mentioned, right? Yeah. As far as the issues that are on the mind of the readers and the reading audience, but also of the writer, and how the fictional text in the form of a diary published serially, right, in dailies and weeklies, provides an opportunity to weigh in on some of the kind of hot button issues of the time. So you mentioned free love, right? And I wanted to dig into this a little bit deep because it's such an interesting issue. So, contextually, Karpilove is engaging in with the ideas of kind of radical thinkers who, like she, right, come from the Russian Empire, and some of them still live, right, in what during the serialization of the novel becomes the new Bolshevik state. That's something else that happens between 1916 and 1918. And some of them immigrate, right? So kind of when I was reading the book, I was thinking about the Russian feminist, radical anarchist writer Alexander Kollontai, who during the serialization of the novel gets appointed as the commissar for social welfare in the first Bolshevik government, and I believe is the first woman who is appointed to a government. I need to check my footnotes in this, but maybe I'm wrong. But she's like among the first. She has written by that point about how from, and I'm quoting Kollontai, from the very early stages of its social being, humanity has sought to regulate not only sexual relations, but love itself. And moreover, right, from her thesis on communist morality in the sphere of marital relations, writes that the form of marriage and the form of family is determined by the economic system of a given epoch, and it changes as the economic base of society changes. The family, in the same way as government, religion, science, morals, law, and customs, is part of the superstructure which derives from the economic system of society. So kind of creating really dwelling on the fact that marriage is a bourgeois institution, right? Is a social institution that in some ways limits the agency of women in particular. But kind of more, maybe closer to Karpilove's content would be Emma Goldman, who also comes out of that sort of radical Russian tradition, is in New York, right, during the serialization of the novel, is arrested and deported to Bolshevik Russia. So I wanted to ask you to kind of define free love for us in this context, maybe with these other thinkers like Emma Goldman.
Yeah. So absolutely, and Karpilove, I think, is very directly engaging with this kind of anarchist understanding of free love, and she's living, the character is living in this kind of bohemian world of liberal thinkers and activists. There's a moment when one of the men who courts her, who is the kind of the longest courtship, who I call C, because she labels them Aleph, Bet, Gimel after the letters of the alphabet, and so I name ABC. So the third guy she dates, C, is trying to convince her to have a free love affair with him, and so he sets up a public lecture where he lectures as though he were Emma Goldman. There's a line like he could pull Emma Goldman out of his pocket or something like that. He's so much better talker than even she is, about free love. And so there's a kind of political positioning of his. It's kind of an age-old relationship between men and women of, oh, you should have sex with me now, right? But it's a politicized one, right? Where he's doing it in the context of a kind of leftist agitation. But Miriam Karpilove seems to come out against free love, right? This is the battle against free love. And so one might think of this as being a very conservative text politically if it's against the anarchist idea of free love, but I don't think that's what she's doing, because she's also against marriage, right? This is a woman who, the narrator goes through all of these different suitors. Several of them are proposed to her as possible shidduchs, as marital relationships, and she's not interested in that. Marriage would also be a kind of trap for this single woman, but so is free love. And what's going on there? And it seems to be that she's in this kind of no man's land where, and I use that very intentionally, right, in this kind of war metaphor, where if misogyny continues to be the law of the land, if you will, if that's how people are going to engage with sexual relations, then women are no more free in free love relationships than they are in marriage, right? If Emma Goldman is saying marriage is a kind of prostitution, that it's about women sort of selling their sexuality, selling themselves in order to have the comforts of a home, right? And that's what marriage is, then so is free love when men have all the power in society, right? That it's about, then women have to use their sexuality almost sort of economically. And she makes this argument very explicitly in a number of times in the text. But one of them is there's a part where the protagonist accuses the radical leftist man, again, this is C, who's pursuing her, of cheapening her in her own eyes so that he can get a bargain when he manages to have sex with her, right? Because he sort of is constantly diminishing her, and she says, you're playing a game, you're trying to get a bargain, right? And she's putting it in an economic context and calling it a kind of capitalism. You're cheapening me, you're devaluing me and my labor as a person, you know, in my sexual labor, if you will. And that is capitalism, right? And you're supposed to be some kind of radical, but the way that you're employing free love is in no way free. And so she wants to be, she knows that sexuality, it has an economic component. She mentions this a number of times, that women are asked to be in free love relationships with men until the men complete their college degrees, and then they dump these women and go marry other wealthy women, right? So women are sort of supporting men while they're making their way in the world. And in that context, sexuality is an economic proposition. And she does not want to be devalued on the free love market or on the marriage market. It's about dignity in relationships between men and women, but that dignity is framed economically as well.
Which of course also brings up the kind of questions of class and the way that Karpilove and her narrator right, relate to people of different classes moving in that environment in New York. So this is, as I was sort of thinking about this, also reminds me of Kollontai, who in 1909 had written how, you know, bourgeois women are interested in feminism as long as they're equal in their, you know, kind of subservient status to their proletarian sisters. But the moment that they get elevated into a kind of higher class, they forget, right, about women of the lower classes. And the alliance is not along the lines of gender identification, but along the lines of economics. So, you know, kind of reading this novel, you know, I may be aware of the, particularly the, you know, the setting, the kind of landscape, I guess, of New York City in the 19-teens, as the protagonists move between, you know, they're people of somewhat different classes, right, as the narrator moves through the spaces. And in particular, you know, like the discussions, you know, there's such an obsession for her with things like housing, right? Yeah. The sort of really immediate manifestations of kind of where she is both in her class, but also gender. So I wanted to, if you wanted to talk a little bit about kind of those constellation of those things.
Yeah, we don't know what the narrator does for a living. We know that she has a job. Presumably it doesn't pay very much money. She lives in rented rooms in apartments of landladies who own, or families who own tenements, or who rent tenement buildings, so she sublets single rooms in those buildings. And her existence there is extremely precarious. She's constantly worried that she'll be kicked out of those rooms, and she is several times kicked out of those rooms, and that is a preoccupation of the book. It's a very claustrophobic book. A lot of it takes place in these tiny little rooms in other people's apartments, and she's worried she'll be overheard and people will see her with men in these apartments and they will kick her out. And so it's not only her own sort of virginity that's at stake in a kind of like Samuel Richardson's Pamela kind of way. It's also her housing stability. That's a housing crisis as well, because if she's caught in these rooms with her landladies, she'll be kicked out. And so that, I think, is an element of the class component. She says, actually, as you were talking, I was remembering that in very early in the novel, in chapter 3, the very beginning of chapter 3, these are very short chapters, so it's really the first couple pages of the novel, she has this kind of lyrical moment. It's spring again, the holiday of love is here again. And then she says, the youth of the woman is the springtime of her life. That is the youth of a wealthy woman. The lonely poor girl has no spring. For her, it's always autumn and winter. And it's this kind of melancholy of writing a romance novel from the perspective of a poor woman who can't afford romance. And so I think you're absolutely right to kind of think about this in class terms as well. And that she's very keenly aware that she's writing with an eye toward that kind of precarity.
And kind of the way that she, again, it kind of engages with these questions come often in form of dialogue with, various suitors.
Yeah.
And it's so, and my students commented on this and had kind of a lot of fun actually thinking about the way that she interacts with them like in language, right? The way that she responds to them, often very laconically, with a kind of wry humor, monosyllabically, reacting to these like very verbose men who articulate kind of cerebral ideas about free love while trying to essentially sleep with her,
Yeah.
right? So the kind of the purpose of their language is to kind of couch their sexual desire within this kind of world of ideas, and she responds to this as kind of caustic, laconic way. So I just wanted to ask you as a translator, kind of how did you find kind of finding that kind of balance to really get that humor across, because it really comes across really well.
It was so fun. Like I said, I feel like she's in some ways very similar to me in tone, so it didn't feel always so hard. But there's a way that like I would be reading it and I would say, why is she giving these men so much space? They keep talking. Why do I have to hear these men articulate over and over again these claims about why she should sleep with them? And then at a certain point I say, the humor kicks in and you say, okay, she went 2 sentences too far to the point where they are absurd because they're talking so much and because the narrator is just responding sort of monosyllabically. And so and then you have to remember, these aren't actually actual men speaking. They are Miriam Karpilove, pretend, and so if you sort of put all of that together, then all of a sudden they become the butt of humor, although they're not aware of that. And the woman saying one syllable suddenly turns their words into a joke. Isn't it so absurd that they go on and on for a page and a half about why she should sleep with them, and she is able to deflect it with one word, and it kind of bursts their bubble. And so so it's very their verbosity is quite comical in that way, and the term mansplaining and the whole idea of Me Too sort of evolved and became quite emerged in popularity at the moment when I was translating this book. And so I suddenly had new language for the things that I was experiencing as I was writing in this book. Like, oh, that's what he is. He's a mansplainer. And so that was kind of sort of, I don't know, fun and also maybe disappointing as well to see how current this 100-year-old book is.
Right. I mean, that's what the students find so refreshing, but it's also like what's really interesting, what's really wonderful about the book is that it's unpredictable in the way that we now think about these issues, because it seems to, like on the surface, to stake out the positions that are not the positions we immediately think of as subversive, right? So the way that you talked about, it's a book against free love, right? But it's the kind of the way that it articulates it, right? Sort of forces us as readers to really think about what that proposition means to single women who are immigrant and maybe of lower classes, but also with the allowing the men to go on for too long, right? This is something that we are very aware of at the moment, right? About giving men so much space, that here turns into a kind of tool of humor, right? That the way to really kind of undermine them is precisely by letting them, talk themselves into a...
Right, and it kind of reminds you of also of sort of like a Sholem Aleichem monologue or something, right? You just let them talk and represent the patterns of speech, and the truths come out through that process as well. And I also want to say, like, when you're thinking about these kind of counterintuitive positions that she stakes out that are surprising, right? This is maybe we would call it a feminist novel, but she's anti-birth control. And sort of learning about, that's always a sort of a shocker when I'm talking to people about this book and thinking about, well, what are the stakes for her in the question of birth control? And she sees it as being about women's bodily autonomy, that if women if birth control becomes widespread, then in a kind of free love moment, women will be expected to use birth control. And then the excuse of saying, I don't want to have sex with you because I might get pregnant, goes away. And so it's her ability to, it seems like most of what she is trying to do is avoid having sex, and her ability to avoid having sex is taken away if birth control becomes an option. So again, it's a, you have to go beyond what is her position. She's against free love, she's against birth control, and say, well, what are the stakes for her? What is it that she's for? And it is women's dignity, it's women's bodily autonomy, and so forth. And those are the positions that maybe are behind opposite ideas about birth control today.
Interesting. And kind of thinking about the kind of this issue, there was a wonderful recent review of the book by Faith Jones, and she was asking this question, and it's kind of goes to what you just said, I think, in some way. The kind of what Faith Jones proposed, she wrote about kind of reading this novel queerly, with a queer set of eyes. To read queerly, she writes, is to allow heteronormative texts, such as this one, right, appears to be, to speak queer truth regardless of the writer's intentions. Irritated with the aggressive straightness of Miriam Karpilove's Diary of a Lonely Girl, I, right, Faith Jones, ask myself, is it possible to approach this novel queerly? Can I reframe our unnamed narrator in her dreary trek through unappealing courtship rituals as a story that affirms other modes, other mores, and a rich diversity of sexual being, right? So kind of the way you discuss her thoughts about birth control and the desire not to have sex makes me kind of think about that there's maybe some possibility here, but like what's your take on reading it queerly?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of ways to look at it. One is that she has this one female friend, Ray, in the book, and that seems to be a kind of outlet, and another way of being socially in the world that doesn't have the same kind of pressures. There's a night the two of them spend in the narrator's bedroom together, and presumably in a non-sexual fashion. They stay up late talking about the men they're dating and so forth. And the next morning, the landlady knocks on the door saying, "Oh, you know, I heard that there was someone in your room all night." And the narrator sort of gleefully opens the door, and it's another woman, and she's sort of like, "Haha, you didn't catch me this time," or something. And there's a almost a playful hint at homosexuality, and I have seen it hinted at in others of Karpilove's works as well. And so it's not, I do think that like reading it in that direction is also possible. But I think beyond that, what Faith is pointing out is that this is she's right that it's a relentlessly sort of heterosexual world that this narrator is operating in. But that part of that heterosexuality has to do with the inequality of men and women, that there's this relentless structure to the relationships that exists both in marriage and in free love relationships, in which there's this power imbalance. And it exists when the narrator is with a married man, and it exists when the narrator is with a single man who would maybe one day like to get married to someone who is wealthier than she is. It exists in every single relationship that she's in. And there's a kind of longing for some other kind of relationship that would be more equal. And I think that could be with a man or with a woman, but in the context of relationships that are predicated on gender imbalance, looking for some other kind of, or power imbalance, looking for some other kind of relationship is, I think, inherently queer, whether or not it's with someone with a male or female body.
Right, no, exactly. I mean, that's and again, like, I think that, you know, I kind of in the back of my mind, right, is how I set up this conversation, is that I find this book to be such a valuable addition to a syllabus today. And I think a lot of our students are really kind of very open to this kind of queer reading, right? It isn't about homosexuality per se, but really is about, right, other modes that we can find in texts that are not overtly, right, or at their time would not have been thought by their writers to be in any way what we would call today queer, that it's just such a productive way of reading. And a lot of our students kind of relate to it in the way that they themselves understand the world in these texts. Let me maybe just ask one more question, maybe two if we have time, but I think we're kind of low on time here. So maybe just one more, and really about your kind of role as a translator here, and various challenges that I surmise you would have faced from the different aspects of the text. So the text has many things. It is, you know, it's a diary, right? So it's you know, maybe in a tradition of literary fiction that is written in diary form. As a diary, it is maybe also a bit of a melodramatic kind of text, which is also its own kind of beast. It is also a text that is in Yiddish, and any text in Yiddish is not just in Yiddish. Yiddish is always about many other languages, but in a sense that there's an immigrant text and written by an immigrant writer, it is also a text that engages with English, right? And the narrator's kind of attempts to learn English, and her indication, especially by, I think, one of the suitors who takes it upon himself to teach her English, that her English isn't quite up to snuff. But she also reads a lot, and presumably in Russian, right? She reads novels, she reads all kinds of things. So just that kind of a very, I guess, open-ended question: how, as a translator, did you find yourself dealing with these different you know, flavors, I guess, right? Different genres, different modes, different ways in which the text engages in different kinds of linguistics and cultural realities, and, you know, getting them into a text in English.
Yeah, it's a great and very full question. Yes, the narrator is herself quite, she seems to be quite multilingual. There's a moment where she's sitting in the library reading War and Peace in English because she wanted to know how it was different in English than in the Russian. And so we know that she has read the Russian and can read the English, and yet she has this lover who, maybe, I don't know, lover may be the wrong word, but who says, your English is not good enough, let me be your English tutor. And she says, it's because I like Yiddish perfectly well. And he says, Yiddish is not really a language. And she says, fine, if Yiddish is not a language, then I can express myself really well in something that's not a language. So she's sort of very willing to be dismissive of that. And yeah, so she's operating in this very multilingual world with a lot of attention to the politics of language between people. So the excerpt that I'm going to read is about that a little bit, about the status of Russian speakers and the way that she's sort of making fun of Russian intellectuals, who are the pretensions of Russian intellectuals in Yiddish spaces. And so there's a number of times when I decided to leave words untranslated, which, by the way, was difficult for me because I am myself not a Russian speaker. So these Russian words would pop up in Yiddish transliteration, and I would spend a lot of time trying to figure out what they even were, because Russian is not one of the languages that I know, and I have to ask friends or consult various resources to figure out what the context was for these words. And then I left them untranslated and left a glossary in the back, because I felt like that experience was important to the text, right? Because these are pretentious characters who are putting it on by speaking these Russian words, as I was experiencing by reading it and not knowing what those words were, right? I was a recipient of their kind of putting it on-ness. And so I wanted to make that present. And there were similarly some transliterated English words by people who are anglicizing, and there were also characters who speak German. For a while, she's living in the home of a German landlady and represents her language in a Germanicized way. And so I tried to kind of bring the texture of that into the text as well as trying to make it sound like a chatty early 20th century American novel, because I also see her as belonging in a world of writers that I was writing about at the time that I found her. I was writing about Edna Ferber in my dissertation a little bit, and I feel like her writing is in a similar kind of vein as the Algonquin Round Table world, only she was writing in Yiddish, and so we're trying to make it sound a little bit like them as well.
Well, thank you, Jessica. I think that maybe let's hear a little bit from the novel, and then take it to Q&A, and I'll chime in as needed in the Q&A, but thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking about it with you. So I'm going to read from chapter 25, which is titled Among Strangers. And at this point in the book, She has just had to leave her housing, her apartment, her room, and go to another room. And that is because she was discovered with B, this married man that she's been having a relationship with. She was discovered with the lights low with him, and her landlady kicked her out. And so she has to find a new place to live. And so this is where we pick up. Today I begin a new chapter in the story of my diary. In another part of the city, in a new room among strangers. Just now, while I was writing these words, I heard a man's voice in the front room asking, "You rented a room already?" A woman's voice responded, "I rented it to a girl." "A pretty girl?" "Aha, I knew you'd ask." "Why shouldn't I ask? It's only natural. What's it to you? You know I like pretty girls. It's just in my nature." "That's some nature you have. It'd be the same for any man." "But my future son-in-law shouldn't talk that way. He should only care for my daughter." "Well, he certainly can't marry the daughter's mother. That's the way it is. Probably that's the way it's meant to be. You fancy the mother, so you marry the daughter. Bite your tongue," right? So there's this kind of, it's hard when you're reading it out loud to get a sense, but there's a lot of dialogue in this text back and forth, and this is between a future son-in-law and a mother-in-law. "Consider it bitten. Now, how can I get a peek at the new boarder? You probably won't get a chance to see her today. She said she won't be coming home until evening because she has a lot of things to buy. A shame, I'll have to see her another time, but I will see her eventually." They walked away from my room. They didn't realize I was here. I'd already been home from my outing for a while, but I didn't want them to know that. I stayed quiet so they wouldn't find me out. I just wanted to ignore everyone, to be a stranger to the strangers, to be alone with my books. Books are so much better than people. They don't try to find out who and what you are. They just tell you a story, and they do it when you want them to. The voice that had asked about me must belong to the young man who's pursuing the daughter of the house, and the woman's voice is the mother's. She didn't speak more than a few words to me before telling me that her daughter has a boy, a fellow, a gentleman friend. He's a salesman, makes a lot of money, and cares for her. "Oh, he's just crazy for me," she confided to me in English, promising to introduce me. Mind you, crazy for his future mother-in-law. She asked me, "Do you have anyone?" When I told her that I didn't, she said in English, "Too bad," and comforted me with the thought that eventually I'd catch someone. All you need to attract a gentleman friend is to know how to dress up and date in style. Her daughter, who dresses herself like a doll, would help me with that. I thanked her for wanting to help me. I was forced to answer her questions in Yiddish peppered with English and Russian to prove her worth, such as, "What relatives do I have here? How old am I? Do I have a steady position? Do I take vacations? Do I attend gymnasium in Russia? Am I familiar with the Russian classics? Am I, and excuse my pronunciation, am I a paklatnica, a devotee of modern literature?" Because she herself is a strashna reader of anything Russian. She graduated gymnasium with a gold medal. She would show it to me, but it's nowhere to be found. It disappeared into thin air. When you come to America and become a mother with many children, medals don't matter to you anymore. You outgrow all that. As the children grow, you have to chase after them and make yourself into an American so they won't laugh at you. There used to be a girl staying with them, she told me, who seemed to be an intellectual. People were good to her the way only intellectual people can be to a lonely girl in a position of some education. But she didn't know how to show her appreciation. She was ungrateful and handled herself poorly. I didn't want to hear any more about that girl. I resolved I wouldn't let anyone be good to me like that. I don't want anyone to pity me or to talk about me in front of other people.